Hello and welcome back to the Pisky Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. Hope you're all well, and a big thank you to all of you who've been listening and supporting the series so far. We're now into October, and it's been a bit of a weird one here in Cornwall. Last week it was still about 22 degrees and it felt really hot and humid. But today, as I'm recording, it's become a bit murky and quite rainy. So it definitely feels like autumn is now underway. And speaking of autumn, if you're a fan of Halloween and a good local ghost story, then on the 17th of October I'm going to be at Inter Bodmin at the old library there, giving a talk exploring some local ghost stories and how they fit in with the local landscape and the local history here in Cornwall. I'm then going to be at the Polly in Falmouth on the 29th of October, and on Halloween itself I'll be at the Acorn in Penzance. So if, like me, you're a fan of a local ghost story and you're interested in local folklore, then I'll pop links to those events in the show notes. Right, I think that's it for news at my end, so let's crack straight on with the episode. It's an exciting one because we're going to be looking at a topic that we haven't really explored or talked about at all, I don't think. But it's a theme that crops up in quite a number of Cornish folk tales, and that is giants. I'm sure many of us grew up hearing stories of giants or ogres or trolls, whether it's in traditional fairy tales, in books, in fantasy films and TV, but they're quite a common type of character. And here in Cornwall, they're firmly rooted in a range of different stories, particularly in the area around West Cornwall. I can remember when I was maybe about 7 or 8 years old, going down to the attraction at Land's End. And there used to be a thing there called the Last Labyrinth. I don't know if anyone else remembers this. We're going back here to the 1990s. But you'd walk through and there'd be a mixture of storytelling and narration with these waxworks and moving set pieces. For instance, I think they had a big model ship that would become shipwrecked and that kind of thing. But at one point, they mentioned giants in the Land's End area, and that they were in the habit of eating small children. And at that moment, this huge model of a giant would suddenly be illuminated, accompanied with this booming voice. And as a young child, I think I was both a bit terrified, but also fascinated by the idea that there might have been these enormous mythical beings known as giants. For whatever reason, we seem to have a real thing for giants here in Cornwall. And some of the stories have become quite famous over the years. I'm thinking of the giant of St Michael's Mount, for instance, or Bolster over near St Agnes. So I thought it was high time that we addressed this topic of giants, looking at some of these local stories, the themes within them, and some theories as to their origins and their significance as well. As soon as I had the idea for this topic, there was one person that I knew immediately it would be worth having a chat with, and that's the brilliant Mike O'Connor, who's been a guest on the series before, talking about mermaids and more recently to talk about the theme of the white hare. Because Mike has such a fantastic wealth of knowledge when it comes to all things folklore and storytelling, I thought he'd be the perfect person to discuss giants with. So you're going to be hearing extracts from our chat on the subject. Anyway, that's enough waffle from me. So without further ado, here's our next episode, Cornish Giants. in wandering over some of the uncultivated tracts, which still maintain their wildness, austerely and sullenly against the march of cultivation, we're certain of finding rude masses of rock which have some relation to the giants. The giant's hand, or the giant's chair, or it may be the giant's punch bowl excites your curiosity. What were the mental peculiarities of the people who fixed so permanently those names on fantastic rock masses? What are the conditions, mental or otherwise, necessary for the preservation of these ideas? The opening line there from a chapter in Robert Hunt's Popular Romances of the West of England, where he talks of wandering around places like Carn Bray and the rocky outcrops in places around Cornwall, and up on Dartmoor as well, curious about the way that people in the past associated these particular places in the landscape with stories of giants. For me at least, West Cornwall is the first area I think of when it comes to giant stories. And I have to wonder if it's because of the nature of the landscape there. If you've been down to West Penwith, for instance, you've got this real concentration of ancient sites, whether it's Iron Age hill forts, stone circles, cairns and quoits. It's quite easy to imagine these big old giants hefting stones about, so that they're sort of littered about the place essentially. I'm pretty sure that if you were to do an online search and type in something like Cornish myths and legends, among the top results would probably be stories of piskies, mermaids, and giants. So they play a big part in local folklore, and some of those stories are still being told today. I'm always curious about why that is. Where do these stories come from, and why might there be an abundance of giant stories here in Cornwall? Recently, I sat down to have a chat with Mike O'Connor, a storyteller, writer and musician, and these were some of the questions that I put to him at the outset. I guess how to start. Why do you think there's such an abundance of giant stories in Cornwall? Do you think it's a lot of landscape-driven things, the factors that are in there?
I think that that's a great theory, and I certainly don't disagree. There are one or two other things that we can say about giants in Cornwall. That some of them certainly have their genesis in the landscape, and in fact, there's a sort of a theory that says, at the simplest level, particularly in West Cornwall, landscape features are associated with giants in general, unidentified giants. And Borlase, in fact, wrote that we attribute all great works of the ruder kind to giants. But the next level of sort of engagement with giants is when specific features have specific giants. They still probably don't have a name as such, but they call things like the giant of Tregroban, the giant of Morva, or something like that. And some of them have behaviours ascribed to them, usually things like stealing cattle. And then at the greatest level engagement, level 3, if you like, you get giants that are named, and they usually also have stories. So these include giants like Cormoran in St Michael's Mount and his wife Cormelian, and Bolster, for example, over on St Agnes Beacon. So those 3 levels occur. Now, but it's not just the landscape. So, for example, there are giants supposedly at Lanihorn Castle and Trelonk. Where the hell's Trelonk? It's a farm that's just a mile from Lanihorn Castle. And the castle was built sometime shortly after 1334. We know that because that John le Archdeacon got a license to crenellate in 1334. If you were going to fortify your house, you had to have a license to crenellate. And he only got a license to crenellate because he was worried about what his tenants thought of him. And so I think what's happening here is that John the Archdeacon at Lanihorn Castle was probably a bit of a miserable so-and-so, and his tenants on the land nearby at Trelonk didn't think much of that. We've got a human rivalry that's happening sometime around the year 1334. And by the time you get to 1824, so about 500 years later, you've got tales of giants in those places. So you've got a journey from a human rivalry to a mythical rivalry that took about 500 years. Another example of that sort of thing is up at Warbstow. Warbstow Bury Hill Fort was occupied until the late Iron Age. And in the middle of it, there's what archaeologists call a pillow mound. And it's probably actually an artificial rabbit warren that was made for the nearby manor house. And the manor actually dates from before 1150. But folklore says that the Warbstow giant is buried underneath that mound. And he was buried there having been defeated by the giant of Tregear Beacon, which is like 5 miles down the road. And people started calling that mound, that pillow mound, the giant's grave. And so once again, we've got a journey from what was probably fact to folklore that takes about 500 years. And so these are about, we've got tales about real people who were probably landlords or local warlords or somebody like that. And by the time 500 years has passed, it's turned into a tale of rivalries between giants. And so, for example, Bolster on Agnes Beacon is supposed to have killed the giant of Carnbray, whose name was John o' Gaunt. Interestingly, real historians at this point will be turning in their graves saying, what has John of Gaunt got to do with it? And the answer is not much, but that's what they called him. And John of Gaunt was killed because Bolster was lobbing great stones at him. And you can still see the stones on the slopes of Carnbray, of course. So once again, we're probably talking about rivalries between local warlords, petty kings, that sort of thing. It's interesting because Bernard Deacon's latest sort of history book, Cornwall's Golden Age, it talks about how do you explain away the interesting gaps between fairly well attested kings of Cerno back in the sort of pre-Saxon times. And Bernard Deacon suggests that, in fact, perhaps people were all lovey-dovey and living in pleasant sort of socialist communities at that time. I think that the tales of giants suggest that that wasn't quite the case, and what you'd got is just local warlords who controlled smaller areas of land and were rivals one to the other. And that sort of, if you like, filled in the spaces between the more dominant kings like Constantine and Urban and Gerons and Caddo and the ones that are sort of half historical, half mythical creatures. They were probably there, but probably not quite in the way that they're recorded in books like The History of the Kings of Britain, which is sort of 90% fiction anyway. But I think giants are important in Cornwall, not because they represent a mythical past, but because they're present right at the founding of Cornwall, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth. You're probably aware that, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the British Isles were settled by effectively the descendants of refugees from the fall of Troy. Led by one Brutus, who in fact had been exiled from Italy because he inadvertently killed his father whilst out hunting. And so Brutus sets off round the Mediterranean in his boat. Eventually, he's directed by one goddess or another, I can't remember which one, to go and find an island somewhere and settle it. And of course, he lands at Totnes and says, "Brilliant! I found the island I'm supposed to find. I shall call it. I shall name it after me, and I shall call it Britain." False etymology, but that's what the book says. And then, but at that point, he and his team have to decide where they're going to go and what they're going to do. And so part of the team, in fact, Brutus's right-hand man, is a chap called Corineus, who was also a descendant of Trojan stock. And he decides he wants to stay in Cornwall because his favourite sport is fighting giants, and Cornwall is full of giants. And he has a fight with the leader of the giants, Gog Magog, and throws him over a cliff onto the rocks at Plymouth, in fact. And so Corineus became ruler of the land, which he named Cornwall after himself. Again, completely false etymology, but that's what Geoffrey of Monmouth says. The significance of that is not the false etymology, but the fact that Geoffrey of Monmouth felt it necessary to invent a tale in which there were lots of giants in Cornwall. So I think he would have only done that if tales of giants were already prevalent in Cornwall. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, Corineus could have had a fight with a local chieftain, or who could have had a fight with the local equivalent of Boudica or somebody like that. But he didn't. He had a fight with giants. So I think the tales of giants were there before Geoffrey of Monmouth. So these stories were probably around before 1134, which is when we are told that the History of the Kings of England was written. And if they're around before that time, that means very clearly those tales were in the Cornish language, which is interesting to itself. And then when we look at the Cornish language, over the years, you don't find a Cornish word for giant. You find quite a few Cornish words for giant. Cawa, Encanethel, Gideon, Resor, Keth Eska, and Gian, or Gian. The fact that they've got, what was that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different words for giant. You don't need 6 different words for giant unless you have got stories. That's my contention anyway. It's one of these things you can never prove. And if somebody says to me, "Mike, you can't prove that," of course I can't. However, in English, there is really only one folkloric word for giant, and that's giant. Other words like sort of ogre and colossus come along really quite late in the day. Ogre doesn't appear until after Perrault's Mother Goose Tales in the late 17th century, and obviously Colossus, which comes originally from the Greek, that hardly appears in English folk tales except in sort of Victorian rewriting. But yet in Cornwall, in the Cornish language, we've got 6 words for giant. So I reckon that those words were there for a good reason. They were there because there were lots of stories about giant. And interestingly, there is a special word for a she-giant. Gaethon is a she-giant, which tells you that stories about giantesses like Cormelian and Aunt Venna of Treryn and people like that, or the giant's wife at Treen, there must have been stories about female giants before, or way back in history anyway. And so I think that's great. It tells us that these stories weren't one-dimensional. They were certainly had males and females and all the rest of it. And I think that's brilliant. So giants, quite possibly, are some of the earliest stories that you find in Cornwall. Is there external evidence for that? Well, yes, there is. It's a little obscure, but it is absolutely there. Some years ago now, well, 2016 actually, two scholars, Sarah De Silva and Jamshid Tarani, they're scholars of language, and what they did was they compared scholarship on the spread of Indo-European languages, and they compared that with data on story collection. And what they were able to do was correlate certain story types with certain language groups in different places and in different ages. And four story types that are found in Proto-Celtic and Proto-Germanic languages, which are the forebears of Celtic and English, okay? Four story types could be mapped all the way back to Proto-Indo-European. And those story types were The Smith and the Devil, Boy Steals the Ogre's Treasure, Animal Bride, and Grateful Animals. And Jack the Giant Killer, of course, is a prime example of Boy Steals the Ogre's Treasure. By the way, the use of ogre there, that's a folklorist term, not something that's sort of particularly in the tale. So it's quite possible that something like Jack the Giant Killer, understanding that tales evolve over the centuries, was around in Proto-Indo-European. And now dating Proto-Indo-European is a mug's game, but we're talking about 6,000 years ago. So it's quite possible that tales of giants came to Cornwall with the first Celtic migration a very long time ago indeed, sort of 5,000 years ago, something like that. So yes, giants are probably the starting point for a lot of folklore in Cornwall.
Some fascinating stuff there, and I'm really intrigued by this idea that some of these stories may have evolved from tales around local landowners or even local warlords. The focus around strategic places in the landscape and how that might be caught up with local rivalries and conflicts as well. The result being, over time, these giant stories. I mentioned earlier how there seemed to be a real concentration of giant stories in West Cornwall. But when I was doing a bit of research, I came across one particular story that was slightly different, and it's set up on Bodmin Moor. Instantly, I found it quite intriguing because not only is the geographical place of note, but also the style of the story is very different too. I first encountered it in Anna Chorlton's brilliant book, Cornish Folk Tales of Place, but it originally seems to have been written down by a man named J. Henry Harris in a book entitled Cornish Saints and Sinners back in the early 1900s. It's basically a story to explain the origin of the cheese ring up on Bodmin Moor. It's quite long-winded, so I've had to cut it down a tiny bit. But what I'm going to do is quote directly from Harris, because then I think you get a sense of the style and the tone of his work. And it reads as follows. The story opened at a period when the saints had been some time in the land, and the people took kindly to them and brought them fish on Fridays. The giants grew jealous and resolved on holding a conference, and when they were all assembled, Uther was voted to the chair, because he had the broadest shoulders and the best headpiece of all the race from Tamar to Polpedin. The question was, what shall we do with the saints? St. Two had a little well all to himself. He was but a small and weakly man, but he was young and full of zeal. The conference was held in what he called his sphere of influence, and when he heard the mighty shouts, he looked upwards and saw a sign. Then he hastened to the conference, and by dodging in and out between the giant's legs, he managed to reach the president. "Pick me up," said St. Two. So Uther picked him up and showed him to the assembly, and, being a strong man himself, he admired pluck. "What do you want here, my little man?" asked Uther. "I want to challenge you to a trial of strength, but let me speak to the giants," replied the saint. Uther stood St. Two on the palm of his hand and held out his arm so that he might speak, which he did in a loud voice, telling them solemnly that they were warring against heaven and one mightier than they, and finished by challenging the mightiest to a contest of rock hurling. If he were beaten, all the saints would leave the land, but if he won, then the giants were to be baptized with the sign of the cross. Now, Uther was a champion rock hurler, and it was a pastime with him to throw rocks like quoits, and so truly as to balance them one on top of the other. The game was no child's play, and the assembled said if Uther would accept the challenge, they would abide by the result. When they looked at St. Two and the rocks to be hurled, they laughed mockingly. There were 12 rocks in all. They had been used before and were fairly round. The smallest was hurled first, and Uther pitched it 100 feet. St. Two's knees rocked. What if his faith should fail him now? He cast his eyes upwards, and then, oh blessed miracle, the rock was as a feather in his hand, and he hurled it with such precision that it capped number 1 as though it grew there. So the game went on, and the pile grew more and more like a mushroom. The giants shouted mightily when Uther's rock capped the saints, but when the saints capped Uther's, they groaned aloud. It was the saints' turn to hurl the last rock, which, being the heaviest and largest, and having to be thrown the highest, required the greatest skill and judgment and strength. The slightest error, and the pile would topple over. The silence was so great that a grasshopper was heard to chirp. True as a die, the rock settled on the rest, and the whole mass swayed upon its stem, but fell not. The victory was not yet, and a 13th rock was brought, and so huge was it that the giant knew it was beyond his powers to hurl. But he raised it with both hands and threw it with all his might and strength, and fell prone to earth, exhausted. The rock fell short, and was rolled back to where St. Two stood, trembling once again. Would heaven fail him now? But no. His eyes were opened, and he saw an angelic host raise the stone to his hand, carry it through the air, and place it as a crown upon the ring. Then Uther bowed his head in humility, and confessed his sins, and was baptized, and some followed his example. But more returned to their castles and did what scathe they could. But the saints rejoiced when they heard what St. Two had done, and were made free of the land. So the saints triumphed, and the cheese ring is their memorial. So you can see, I think, how Christianity is very much the focus of this story. It's very different to other giant stories that I've come across in Cornwall. And here the giants are obliged to convert to Christianity, or else they disappear into obscurity. It's quite an unusual story, and it's one that I asked Mike about. We started off chatting about the prevalence of giant stories in West Cornwall, and then moved on to discuss this story about the cheese ring. There seems to be quite a concentration in West Cornwall in particular. Do you think that is partly because, I mean, there are quite a concentration of particular sites, and some of them do have names like giants attached to them. Do you think that there's a kind of correlation there because of the nature of the landscape in West Cornwall?
Yes, I absolutely do, because the Cornish landscape there has got lots of rocky lumps on the tops of hills, tors. Then they are very often called giants' houses, and other structures are also assigned to giants. Cliff castles and hilltop defended sites are very often assigned to giants as well. I mean, I've identified 38 giants that are mentioned in literature concerning sort of Cornwall. And some of them are very credible, and some of them you think, well, that was made up by a 20th century storyteller, perhaps. And not that that's necessarily bad, but if you're trying to look back in history and understand these things, then it's a little bit more well, that becomes more challenging. But you're quite right. If you map these out, there are a lot more in the west of Cornwall than there are in other places. And in fact, a good question is, why are there no giants in the middle of Bodmin Moor, for example? There are lots of rocky lumps in the middle of Bodmin Moor, but there aren't giants there. The only giant tale there really is the tale of St. Two and a giant called Uther. Now, this appears in a book that was published in 1912 by a man I think called J.H. Harris, not the Cornish poet Harris, a different Harris. The book is quite whimsical. I think that's the friendliest term I can use. It's got some folk tales in it. Well, no, I'm being unkind. It's got quite a lot of folk tales in it, but it's also got other tales that look like folk tales that don't appear anywhere else at all. And I think that Mr. Harris has made them up. St. Tew, T-U-E, is not known anywhere else. And the giant Uther is not known anywhere else. So they suddenly appear on the scene in this book in 1912. And so I think that they're they're probably a figment of the imagination. I mean, it's a fun story, and the competition between the saint and the giant. But Harris does all sorts of other strange things as well. He talks about fights between saints and piskies. I don't think there are, although the great war between the saints and the piskies. No one else in the world talks about a great war between saints and piskies. In fact, piskies seem to quite happily coexist with the Christian religion on the understanding that they're not good enough for heaven, but not bad enough for hell, but just right for Cornwall. And so there's just no conflict in folklore between piskies and church at all. So it's I think Harris just sort of made it up, to be honest.
It's a weird one, isn't it? Because it feels a little bit like, because there's a lot of in that story, from what I remember, the giants are kind of depicted as sort of representing the old ways, and they're encouraged basically to convert to Christianity in that story. There's that sort of, whoever wins, you know, the deal is either the saints leave Cornwall or the giants convert to Christianity. And so it kind of raises lots of questions about the role of giants and how that fits in with Christianity, if you like.
Well, I think it asks you the question about what is the motivation of Harris in writing that story. I don't think that, I think in folklore, giants by and large are cheerfully, they're certainly not Christian, they're not anything. Most of them are cheerfully immoral. But they do very human things. They covet land, they want wives, they want children. There's a story of a giant's child going child stealing. They control areas of land, sometimes with the consent of the locals who give them cattle and sheep to eat, and sometimes they just don't care. They just steal the cattle and sheep and whatever they need. All the actions of giants, in fact, those are those of petty warlords or local chieftains, And the question of whether their actions are moral or not just simply doesn't rise. They just behave the way that bloodthirsty individuals who seek power and wealth have behaved since time immemorial and still behave to this day. I mean, if you look at the map and plot giants out, you find that there are a heap of giants that are associated with hills and land feet, that sort of thing, prominent features in West Penwith. And then others that appear in cliff castles around the coast. So we're talking about people like a giant, well, Bolster being one, and another one, Roth at Portreath. At Bedruthen Steps, you've got another giant there. You've got one on the Rumps. You've got the Watcher of the West. That's just north of Padstow. You've got one on the Dodman. And these are all giants who are linked with cliff castles. And usually what happens is that one day the castle wasn't there, and overnight it suddenly appears, having been built by, it must have been built by a giant because no human could build it in that time. And that's where the giant lives. That is a absolutely common trope of giants there. And then out of the blue, you get Uther in the middle of Bodmin Moor, who's unlike any other giant there at all. I mean, even the ones, the other ones in North Cornwall, I mentioned at Wobsterbury and Tresmere Beacon. There's another one in Lanston. They're all in defended sites. And arguably, they're also controlling the road from Launceston, where there's the sort of major bridge into Cornwall, the major route into Cornwall from England. They're controlling the route across towards Tintagel and the coast road down into central Cornwall. So that's a good, if you were a warlord, that would be a good place to hang out, And in fact, that sort of thing also applies to some of the West Cornwall giants who control the road, particularly between roughly St Ives and Hale and Mounts Bay. Now that's a strategic road because sailing a little boat in sort of Bronze Age times around Land's End is a pretty dicey business. You've really got to wait until the wind and tide are in your favour. And so the route across, it's only about 6 miles or so from Mounts Bay to Hale Bay. That's an important strategic route. And if I was a warlord back in sort of 4th century Cornwall, I would quite want to control that route because I could either pillage along it or just tax people as they made their way from one bay to another. So that's quite logical, really. So yeah, so we've got mountaintops with lumps of rock on them. Must have been made by a giant. We've got cliff forts, all of which were mysteriously built in one night, must have been made by a giant, and they're around the edges of Cornwall. And then mysteriously, we've got Uther, who is probably a literary invention. Interestingly, the Watcher of the West up at the Rumps Cliff Castle, that's quite possibly a literary invention as well. It doesn't appear until well into the 20th century. But it does, the rock pillar that is the Watcher of the West does look awfully like a human being, viewed from the right angle. So I would imagine that it was called that for a long time before anybody started writing a story about it. So that's the sort of catalogue of the giants of Cornwall.
We then moved on to discuss giants and their role in the mythical origins of Cornwall, and in particular a story that seems to have first been published in the 19th century, but its origins are something of a mystery.
There are 2 other giants that really ought to get mentioned because they're quite important, but they come from Devon. And that's not in their disfavour. They're giants called Tavy and Taurage. And they are friendly giants from Devon that stumble across or find the maiden called Tamara, who lives in a cave near Morwenstow somewhere up in the North Cornwall moors. And of course, she is the daughter of some ogre or troll or something like that, depending on which version you read. She's supposed to stay in her cave and live in the underworld at all times. But of course, she comes out seeking the light. She meets Tavy and Taurage. They all fall in love with each other at once, of course, which is splendid. But then the old troll comes out of his cave and in turn curses them all. And Tamara turns to stone. The tears that she weeps form a pool, which flow into a stream, which flow into a river, which becomes the River Tamar. And in turn, Tavy and Taurage are also cursed and suffer the same fate. And so the waters of the Tavy flow down and join the Tamar. Taurage becomes the Torridge, of course, which flows to the north into the Bristol Channel. So it is almost a Cornish creation myth. And it's quite important because it has that characteristic. It's also a mystery because the first time it appears is in Hunt's book in 1865. And it's at the end, as almost as if it was stuck on as an afterthought. So I wonder where he got it from. It's not from, he doesn't get it from Parson Hawker of Morwenstow. He doesn't get it from Anna Bray at Tavistock, although she does have tales of a shepherd who turns into a river. But the tale of Tamara, its origins really are unknown. So if anybody listening to this podcast knows more about it, I would love to hear, because it's something that's eluded me so far.
I love this story of the three lovers becoming the rivers, with Tavy and Tamara able to join together in the estuary and flow together for all eternity. But at the same time, you do feel for Taurage or Torridge, who's endlessly flowing away in the opposite direction. I want to move on now and delve a bit deeper into some of these giant stories. And I want to begin by taking a look at probably the most famous, the giant of St. Michael's Mount, often called Cormoran. If you've never been to the Mount, I highly recommend it if you get chance. It's this amazing medieval castle built on the top of an island within Mounts Bay and linked by a tidal causeway with Marazion in West Cornwall. I can remember as a kid walking across the causeway to get to the island, and then going up what seemed an endless number of steps to get to the castle. And as you were walking up, there was one particular stone that I remember being told, that's the giant's heart. So of course then my young imagination would start running wild, imagining the story surrounding this great giant that was said to have lived there. There's a couple of stories surrounding the giant of St. Michael's Mount, but probably the most famous is that involving Jack, often called Jack the Giant Killer. Essentially, the story goes that once there was a giant named Cormoran who lived at St. Michael's Mount, and he was feared by all in the surrounding countryside. Every day he would wade across to the mainland, raiding the local farms to steal sheep and cattle, carrying them back for his supper. The people soon began to suffer at the loss of their livestock, but Cormoran was so big and so terrifying that none dared to challenge him. At one of the farms around Marazion lived Jack, son of one of the local farmers. Angry and frustrated, seeing how the farming families toiled all day, but were forced to go hungry when the giant stole from them, he decided it was time to do something about it. One night, he took his father's shovel and a pickaxe and made his way down to the mount. Then taking up the shovel, he began to dig. All night he laboured, digging a great hole in the ground, and when he had finished, carefully covered over the top with earth and straw to disguise it. As dawn came, Jack took up his horn and blew several great blasts. Almost immediately, the giant began to roar, angry at having been so rudely woken from his slumber. He emerged from his cave, saw young Jack, and charged down the hill towards him, the ground shaking beneath his feet. He was but an inch away from grabbing hold of the young man, when suddenly the ground gave way beneath him, and with a cry he plummeted down into the deep hole. Now trapped, he looked up at the boy, who in that moment took hold of his pickaxe, raised it high, and brought it down on the top of Cormoran's head, killing him instantly. The people rejoiced, and Jack became famous all over the countryside. Now, that's just my slightly condensed take on the story. But there are very similar versions of the tale that crop up all over the place. So, what do we know about this story and where it comes from? A few weeks back, I came across an article called Giants of Cornwall that was written by Barbara Spooner, who was a writer and folklorist, and she wrote a lot about Cornish folklore back in the mid-20th century. And she has some really interesting things to say. This is what she writes regarding the story of Jack and Cormoran, and I quote, "Some of the giants' names are not Cornish. Cormelian, or Cormoran, was the name of the Mount Giant in the chapbook series of Jack the Giant Killer, printed in Nottingham and Newcastle upon Tyne. It is not local." She goes on to say, "It was being sold by travelling sellers of chapbooks as the pleasant and delightful history of Jack and the Giants at the beginning of the 18th century. So it's interesting that this particular story surrounding Jack the Giant Killer might have come from these people who were going around selling chapbooks in the early 1700s. Spooner writes that in the local drolls there is a character called Jack, who's known as Jack the Tinner or Jack the Tinker, but he doesn't even meet the giant of the Mount, and the giant isn't killed in some pit, but in fact he grows old and toothless. So there do seem to have been other local stories that mention a giant living at St. Michael's Mount. So I asked Mike his thoughts on this.
Recent reading has kind of given me a few ideas about that, because there's a sort of story around Cormoran, but then there's some slight differences about and theories about the original giant of the Mount, who wasn't necessarily given a name. I wonder what your thoughts were on that, because there seems to be a bit of a hodgepodge going on there around the sort of St. Michael's Mount myths and legends.
Well, the tale of Jack the Giant Killer, as I understand it, first appears in print in about 1707, something like that. And it immediately became very popular and was published in many forms, and a whole series of Jack the Giant Killer stories then appeared, some of which tally with tales that are already extant in Cornwall, in West Cornwall, and some of which appear to have come out of the ether and were presumably either adapted or written in the 18th century. St. Michael's Mount is a prime location for a giant. It used to be a defended site. Even before it was a fortress, before it was a monastery. It's very hard to find the remains now because of the later building on the site, but it was, if you like, a a hill fort type of defended headland site beforehand. So that would make it a prime candidate for a site for a giant. Does anybody else think there's a giant there? Yes, there is actually, because if we look at a book called Polly Albion, which is an enormous poem describing the British Isles, it was written by a man called Drayton in 1612. And there are a set of maps that go with it, beautifully drawn by William Hole. And you find that in this map, drawn about sort of 1612, you find giants sitting on the hills. And there is a giant sitting on Michael's Mount. There's a giant on Meneag. There's a giant in the Roseland. There are other giants on Rowtor and Brown Willie. So the idea of giants being on tops of hills in Cornwall is still in this illustrator's mind in the early 17th century. So I suspect he wouldn't have put the giants there unless he'd been, at least in the most general terms, well aware of tales of giants in Cornwall. So that gets us back to 1612. I know it doesn't quite take us as far back as sort of 1134 and the history of the kings of Britain, but it is a step in the right direction, isn't it? So I think that tales of earlier giants on the mount, or more than one giant on the mount, is completely credible. And the other thing, of course, is that there are, well, I know at least 2.5 stories about giants of the mount. The first is the very well-known Jack the Giant Killer story. And the second one is, believe it or not, a piece of vegetarian advocacy, which is a bit unusual for a Victorian storybook. I don't know if you've come across this one at all.
No, it doesn't sound familiar.
Okay, I'll tell it for you. I'll tell it for you like I was in the story club. Cormoran the Giant was a very grumpy individual. In fact, he was downright bad-tempered. This, of course, is pretty normal. I mean, giants are not known for their sense of humour. And Cormoran, of all the giants in Cornwall, was quite the grumpiest. He was also the biggest, smelliest, and hungriest. Every morning when he woke, he was hungry. And so every morning, he was specially bad-tempered. Thought Cormoran one time, I need my breakfast. So he got out of bed, knocking aside various fleas, rats, ferrets, dogs, and things like that also slept there. He didn't wash, he didn't brush his tooth. He only just had one. He put on his dirty clothes and he set off. And this is the point that I can tell you that although he was very grubby, Cormoran had clean feet. In fact, they were gleaming, and this is because he lived in the cave on St. Michael's Mount, which, as you know, is an island, and every time he waded to the mainland, his feet were washed. But he only had a bath when it was a very high tide. And as he waded out that morning, he grumbled as usual, and his feet were washed again, and crabs nibbled his shiny heels, and eels slithered between his lovely clean toes. Cormoran waded east, past the steep cliffs at Hoe Point until he could say Pengersic Castle. And around it were green fields, and there he would often steal a cow or two for breakfast. He never wondered why no one complained. In fact, he didn't wonder about anything very much, but no one complained because at Pengersic Castle there was usually no one at home. Pengersic was away in the east, secretly learning to be a magician. And after 3 years, he passed all his magic exams, was given a big book of spells and a pointed hat, and was sent back to Cornwall. And next morning, he got out of bed, opened the curtains, and was startled to see a giant picking up 2 of his cows and stuffing them into his trouser pockets. The giant was very big and rather smelly. Pengersic decided that a confrontation would neither be wise nor pleasant, as the giant was 5 times bigger than he was, even when wearing his specially pointed wizard's hat. So it was clear to Pengersic that magic was the answer. Now, he'd never tried casting a spell on anything as big as a giant, so he thought he'd start with something simple. In the field, Cormoran was grumbling because the cows in his pockets were mooing loudly at the prospect of being eaten for breakfast. The morning sun was shining on the giant's gleaming feet, and Pengersic couldn't help but notice them. They gave him an idea. He looked in the book of spells for feet and found the famous Sardinian wobbly feet spell. Pengersic recited the magic words, and Cormoran found his feet behaving like buckets of jelly. He wobbled left, he wobbled right, and he looked very silly. Encouraged by the success of his first spell, Pengersic decided to move up the giant's legs. Having started with the feet, he looked in the book for knees, and there he found the prize-winning Alpine Bendy Knee spell. Again he recited the magic words. Cormoran found his knees bending quite randomly. Sometimes he bent forwards, sometimes he bent backwards. He felt very silly indeed. Now Pengersic was really enjoying himself. He looked in the book for legs, and he there found the world-famous Cornish leg control spell. And for a third time he uttered the magic words. Suddenly, Cormoran found himself not just wobbling backwards, forwards, and sideways, but lurching across the countryside. A big smile was now on Pengersic's lips. By magic, he steered Cormoran across the fields towards the sea. At first, Cormoran didn't mind someone else being in charge of his legs. It was nice not to have the responsibility. But then he saw the sea getting closer and closer, and to his dismay, he realized he was being walked straight towards the cliffs at Clow Point. The giant struggled to stop or change direction, but nothing worked. Steadily, he was wobbled to the very edge of the cliff. He shouted for help, but there was no other giant for miles around. It seemed that he was doomed. At the edge of the cliff, the giant closed his eyes and waited to fall in the sea. Back at the castle, Lord Pengersic was very pleased with his first 3 spells, but casting them was rather tiring, so he decided to go to bed early. He had a light supper, put on his special magician's nightshirt, and went to bed. Out on the headland, Cormoran nervously opened his eyes. In front of him was a huge drop into the sea. The water looked wet and cold, and the rocks were sharp. But now he couldn't move his legs at all. He watched as the sun set. It started to rain. The wind blew. It was dark and cold. He tried sleeping standing up, but it didn't work because the cows in his pockets kept mooing loudly and his wobbly knees were knocking with the cold. The giant had never been so unhappy, and tears welled up in his enormous eyes. At last he saw the first light of dawn appear in the sky. In his castle, Pengersic dressed by the warm fire and had a leisurely breakfast. He had steaming porridge, hot toast, and marmalade. He was reading the morning paper when he was disturbed by a sad wailing sound, like a foghorn, and he remembered that Cormoran was still on the edge of the cliff. The wizard put on his cloak to keep warm, pinned his wizard's badge prominently on the lapel, and put on his pointed hat to look as imposing as possible. Even so, he felt rather nervous, because although Cormoran was rooted to the spot, he was still as tall as a church tower. Luckily, it had rained all night, so Cormoran had been washed in cold water several times and was much less smelly than usual. Pengersic tried to sound imposing. I am the great wizard, Pengersic. My power is absolute. Why shouldn't I throw you into the sea? Cormoran wailed uncontrollably. At the wizard's command, he took the cows from his pockets and put them back on the ground, and they scampered happily away. He promised he would never more steal anything. And then the wizard undid the spells, and the giant sadly walked away. And never again was Lord Pengersic troubled by any giant. Never again did Cormoran steal cows or sheep. And you know, there are still 2 cows who live in a field near Hoe Point, who tell their calves of the story of the day they went for a ride in a giant's pocket. Now, the sequel to that is, of course, that Tom the Tinner lived on the moors of West Penwith. He knew the secret places where streams cut into the granite and washed black tin sand down to the sea. And he heard that there was sometimes treasures concealed in caves. And he had heard that there once had been a giant in a cave on St. Michael's Mount. Was there treasure still there? He made his way to St. Michael's Mount. And to his surprise, when he got to the cave, he heard a low rumbling sound. He guessed it was the giant. He crept up to the cave. Several rats, ferrets, and dogs ran out. Carefully, he tiptoed inside, brushing away the cobwebs. Piled in the corners of the cave were gold and silver, all sorts of treasure. But in the middle of the cave, Tom saw a very sorry sight. It was the giant cormorant sitting on the side of his bed, sighing and weeping. On the floor was a huge bucket to collect the tears, and several small fish were swimming round. The giant's feet were gleaming, but the rest of him was still rather grubby. But more importantly, the rest of him was very thin. When Tom came in, the giant wailed, "Is that you, Wizard Pengersic?" "No," said Tom. "I'm Tom the Tinner. I've come to see you." "You're not going to cast a spell on me?" "No," said Tom. "I'm a tin streamer, not a magician." "You look very thin. Are you all right?" "No," said the giant. "Since the wizard put spells on me, I'm scared to leave me cave. And now I've nothing left to eat. I haven't had me croused for weeks." "Don't worry," said Tom. "I'll get help." And Tom ran across the causeway and straight to his Aunt Nancy's house. She filled a basket with eggs, butter, and cheese. Tom carried a bucket of milk, and they went back to the mount. They clambered up to the cave, and there Aunt Nancy made the biggest omelette the world has ever known. And they fed it, the cormorant, and he loved it. And you know, he said, "Nancy, that was great. Well, what can I do for payment? Tell you what, take some of that treasure there." And you know, for the rest of her life, Aunt Nancy went back there every day and made him a nice omelette. And so it was that Nancy became rich and the giant of the mount became a vegetarian.
Oh, I love it.
I mean, obviously I've dressed that up and told it the way I would tell a classroom of children or something like that. But actually, all of that, in essence, you'll find in Hunt. And I think that's fabulous, because what's happened is that the tale of a giant on the mount, who, I mean, I've called him Cormorant, you can call him what you like, really. He's clearly not the one that was killed by Jack the Giant Killer, because he's dead. Or perhaps this was an earlier event, but I don't think so. So this is another giant living in the mount. And that's not daft, because you've got a defended site over a series of generations. You have a series of warlords who occupy the same site and defend it. I don't recall precisely now, but I think the sort of the archaeology, the pre-monastery archaeology is sort of 6th century and earlier on the mount, which I think is quite credible for tales of giants going back then. So that's Cormoran and his alter ego on St. Michael's Mount.
So it definitely seems like there was an awareness of stories surrounding giants at the Mount, going back to at least the start of the 17th century. Beyond that, it's hard to say, but it certainly seems plausible. The descriptions of Cornish giants really vary, especially when it comes to their height. Some appear to have been about 8 foot tall, but then the next character we're going to look at is described as being so big that he could stand with 1 foot at St. Agnes Beacon and the other at Calm Bray, which is a fair distance of a few miles, so he must have been enormous. And I'm talking here of the giant known as Bolster from over at St. Agnes.
The first time that we find documented evidence of the existence of Bolster is in the early 18th century. And that's when a historian called Thomas Tomkin started compiling a history of Cornwall. And it never got published, but the manuscript survives. He gets quoted by later historians like Hitchens and Drew and people like that. And Thomas Tomkin actually came from Trevornance, which is sort of like just round the corner from St Agnes Beacon. So I think that his is probably a fairly authentic version of the tale. And I mean, his version actually starts with the saint, St Agnes. And we could have another discussion about whether the heroine of the story is a saint by Christian standards, or is actually somebody completely different, and her name was Anne, but has been turned into St Agnes for the purposes of this tale. But anyway, as we have it now, it's St Agnes, who was, in fact, an early Christian in Rome, where she was persecuted. And of course, the tale goes that she fled from Rome by some means or other, came to Cornwall, landing at Perranawyrthel, except it wouldn't have been called Perranawyrthel then, but never mind. And then she came to the place that we now call St Agnes. Interestingly, it says there she was tempted in the same way that Jesus Christ was tempted by the devil. And there's just something you don't find in other versions of the story, that on several occasions he tried to tempt St Agnes, and she, being a very good saint and terribly Christian, managed to know the right words to turn the devil to stone, which he did several occasions until he finally managed to escape, leaving one large moor stone in his place, which still bears the features of the devil. Anyway, on arriving at the place we now call St Agnes, of course, there she was compelled by the giant Bolster to help him pick up boulders, stones that were littering the fields on the top of the beacon there. And 3 times she filled her apron with enormous stones and carried them to the summit of the hill, where they remain to this very day. And on the top of the hill, you will still find 3 barrows that are there. And they're made from the stones carried there by St Agnes. Well, while this was going on, of course, Bolster found himself very attracted to young Agnes and decided that she would have to be his wife. Unfortunately, Bolster is already married, but that didn't really bother him terribly much. And I don't suppose if you were the local warlord, it wouldn't bother you very much either. Anyway, but Bolster was just, he had his eye on young Agnes. And she, being a very cunning lady, said, "Certainly, but I'd just like you to prove that you do indeed love me." And he says, "What can I do to prove to you that you are my heart's desire?" And she said, "Well, if you could just shed a little of your blood, there's this little slit in the rock here, just fill it with some of your blood." Well, that was nothing, because Bolster was huge and the slit in the rock was very small. And what he didn't know, of course, it was a slit that went right the way down into the ocean. And so he slashed his wrist and bled himself to death. And to this day, you look at the sides of the cleft there, and you can see them still stained with Bolster's blood. And Agnes, well, she lived there happily ever after. But I do question whether her actions were truly Christian. I'd have thought that some sort of conversion of if she's got the power to defeat the devil and turn him into stone, I think converting a giant to be a worthy Christian would have been a more appropriate course of action. But who am I to judge what Christianity was like all those years before? Of course, since revival in the 1980s, local citizens joyfully celebrate the demise of Bolster every year. And so I suspect that the tale has been around for a long time. Like I said, Tonkin's account of the early 1700s is the first account of the story. The first account of the saint is in records of the See of Exeter from about 1269. So probably that version of the tale has been around since somewhere around the 13th century. I mean, that's guesswork, of course. Hunt and Bottrell add other details. They add Bottrell's wife. They add Bolster's wife, and she has to carry boulders in her apron as well. And the fact that Bolster could stand with one foot on St Agnes Beacon and the other on Carn Bray gets added in at that point. And in fact, his rivalry with the Giant of Carn Bray resulted in the Giant of Carn Bray being killed by boulders being thrown at him. And of course, the boulders are still there on the hillside. St Agnes Beacon and Carn Bray are either side of both some cultivable land, which is not that common in that part of Cornwall, and they're either side of the main route that runs from down the spine of Cornwall. So it's quite possible that rivalry between two warlords for control of that route lay behind those stories.
We've looked then at a couple of the most famous giants in Cornwall, but I'd now like to explore some other local tales that are perhaps less well known, or certainly aren't talked about as much. One example is a little story I encountered in the third edition of Bottrell's work, entitled The Giant of Carn Galva, a place which it's basically between Zena and Morva, over in West Penwith. And this is what he writes. The Giant of Carn Galva was more playful than warlike. Though the old works of the giant now stand desolate, we may still see, or get up and rock ourselves upon, the Logan stone, which this dear old giant placed on the most westerly cam of the range, that he might log himself to sleep when he saw the sun dip into the waves and seabirds fly to their home in the cleaves. Near the giant's rocking seat, one may still see a pile of cubical rocks, which are almost as regular and shapely now as when the giant used to amuse himself in building them up and kicking them down again for exercise or play, when alone and he had nothing else to do. People of the northern hills have always had a love regarding the memory of this giant, because he appears to have passed all his life at the urn in single blessedness, merely to protect his beloved people of Morva and Zena from the depredations of the less honest Titans who then dwelt on Lelant hills. Carn Galva giant never killed but one of the Morva people in his life, and that happened all through loving play. The giant was very fond of a fine young fellow of tune, who used to take a turn over to the Carn every now and then, just to see how the old giant was getting on, to cheer him up a bit, play a game of bob, or anything else to help him pass his lonely time away. One afternoon, the giant was so well pleased with the good play they'd had together that when the young fellow of tune threw down his quoit to go away home, the giant, in a good-natured way, tapped his playfellow on the head with the tips of his fingers. At the same time he said, "Be sure to come again tomorrow, my son, and we will have a capital game of bob." Before the word bob was well out of the giant's mouth, the young man dropped at his feet. The giant's fingers had gone right through his playmate's skull. The young man was stone dead and cold, long before he ceased doctoring his head. When the poor giant found it was all over with his playmate, he took the body in his arms, and, sitting down on a large square rock at the foot of the cairn, he rocked himself to and fro. Pressing the lifeless body to his bosom, he wailed and moaned over him, bellowing and crying louder than the booming billows breaking on the rocks in Permoina. The giant of Carngalva never rejoiced any more, but in 7 years or so he pined away and died of a broken heart. It's quite a sad story, but in there we have this giant who is represented as a benevolent and kind, playful figure. In fact, these characteristics are something that Bottrell talks about later on in relation to giants in the area around Land's End. He says, and I quote, "All traditional giant stories in this district describe them as amiable protectors of the common folk who lived near their castles. They were, however, invariably stupid and often did mischief unwillingly by having more strength than sense, like the giant of Carngalva and the young man." End quote. There's another example from close by at Morva that I find really interesting. This comes from the 3rd edition of Robert Hunt's work this time, and he says, "In the giant's field in Morva still stand some granite fragments which once constituted the giant's house. From this we see the giant's castle at Busbrennis and the giant's cradle, thus perpetuating the infancy of the great man and his subsequent power. The quoits used by this giant are numerous indeed. This great man, on the first day of August, would walk up to Busbrennis Croft, and there perform some magical rites, which were either never known or they've been forgotten. On this day, for when thus engaged the giant was harmless, thousands of people would congregate to get a glimpse of the monster, and as he passed them, all being seated on the stone hedges, every one drank to the health of Mr. Giant. At length the giant died, but the gathering on the 1st of August has never been given up, or rather the day shifts and is made to agree with Morva Feast, which is held on the first Sunday in August. This is interesting because, again, this is quite favourable to the giant, and it suggests a level of respect and reverence for him. This later adherence to the date as a feast day in the area is the story perhaps to explain the origin of the local feast day. Hunt says at another point that a local farmer from Morva told him, and I quote, "A quarter of an acre would not hold the horses ridden to the fair, the hedges being covered with the visitors, who drink and carouse as in former times. Morva Fair is, however, dying out." This fair, it seems, used to be really popular, and Barbara Spooner tells us that there used to be a local phrase for when something was described as being really crowded. They'd speak of riding 3 on a horse like going to Morva Fair. So we've got a couple of good examples there where the giants are quite likeable. But then you come across the odd tale that seems to offer up a whole different character. Hunt gives an example that seems to counter Bottrell's suggestion that the Land's End giants were all pretty amiable. He talks of how he's heard unruly children being threatened by Trebigan, described as a vast man with arms so long that he could take men out of the ships passing by the Land's End and place them on the longships. He did this by way of a joke, people said, but his daily dinner, chicks, was of little children fried on a flat rock near the cave. Suddenly, all of those childhood memories from the last labyrinth and that local giant devouring children have come flooding back. Moving a little bit further to the east, Barbara Spooner talks about the Portreath giant, who we're told lived in a sea-washed chasm known as the Giant's Zorn or Cave. He was said to terrorise the fishermen around the St Ives area. If the ships were out in deeper water where the giant couldn't reach them, he would hurl great rocks down the cliffs to try and sink them. Bottrell apparently thought that the local tale had more to do with sailors' fears about the tides that could quickly grab hold of ships and wash men into the cave, referred to as a gulping cupboard. Spooner mentions that the place is mentioned on maps as Ralph's or Rafe's cupboard, and that the original name of the giant in the Drolls was Wrath, so presumably the name evolved out of that. Something interesting is that the place where the giant Bolster is said to have let his blood flow was once known as the Wrath's Hole. A theme that crops up in a couple of local stories is where giants throw things like tools to one another, often with tragic consequences.
You hear of giants, like one throws a tool to the other and accidentally kills another giant. Do you think that that is again a hint at, in the stories it can be quite playful, but that there's an element of local conflict within that as well?
There are two such stories about giants chucking tools one to another. One concerns Cormoran, the giant of the mount, and his wife, Cormelian, who rather had an eye on another giant that was just a few miles away. And of course, they shared a hammer or something of that. Maybe it was an axe. No, it was a hammer, I think. And she is inadvertently struck on the head as this hammer comes hurtling through the air. Very sad. However, there is a version of the Warbstowberry giant story, and he is killed by a giant by a hammer that is being thrown, because he shares this hammer with the giant of Lanston, and the giant of Lanston is chucking the hammer there, but his aim is obviously not quite good enough, and it hits the giant of Warbstowberry on the head, and he dies. It's a bit like in hagiography, you have standard miracles and standard deaths of saints. It's almost as if you've got a repertoire of standard deaths and of giants, because there's another tale of a giant bleeding himself to death, and that is the giant of the Dodman, and he is a particularly objectionable giant, tends to go around eating people, has a particular predilection for eating small children. And obviously one day he'd eaten the wrong sort of child or something like that, or had too many and had an upset tummy. So they sent for the doctor, and the doctor said, yes, the only way of curing this is by bleeding you a little to get rid of all these sort of bad things from your blood. And it just so happens there's a cleft in the rock there, if you would mind opening your veins. And he opens the giant's veins and just sort of lets him bleed to death, then pushes him off the edge of the cliff, and the giant's body is still there. It's called the Dodman. And the headland, of course, looks a bit like a body with a sort of a lumpy head on the end of it when viewed from the south and west, if you're sailing up there in your sailing boat. And so that really is a complete analogue of the story of Bolster. And that's a standard demise for a giant. Throwing a tool is a standard demise for a giant. And being killed by a local hero, either deliberately or inadvertently, also happens, because there's a Tom the Tinner fights with a giant one stage, and in a friendly duel, but inadvertently runs him through and kills him. But as a result, inherits the giant's treasure. So it's another boy steals the ogre's treasure class of story. So if you like, in Cornwall, you've got these three standard ways of killing giants. But the giants of Cornwall are very human. They all the things that you'd expect of human beings, in whether it be in Shakespearean drama or when watching Hollywood movies, the giants do them as well.
Something I've encountered a few times are references of giants in relation to fairy folk, particularly spriggans or sprigians, being the spirits of dead giants. Spooner, in fact, writes, "For the most part, their spirits very actively guarded their old haunts, as sprigians, the goblins of the fairy tribes." This was something that I found interesting, so I wondered what Mike's take on it might be.
Talking about this idea of there once being a race of giants in Cornwall, and a link with either the Piskies or Sprigians in terms of being the sort of the spirits of the giants that once inhabited the land, or they become the sort of guardians of ancient sites and things like that. Is that a relatively modern kind of idea, do you think?
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't really see a close folkloric link between tales of giants and tales of small people, of fair people of one sort or another. They seem to be well separated in collections. And as you're probably well aware, Hunt was very methodical in the way he collected his tales and laid them out in his book. And he has a whole section on tales of fairies, piskies, and small people, and has a completely separate section on tales of giants. The tales of piskies, of fairy folk generally, seem to appear in Cornish folklore in the 17th century. I mean, the first clues are in Shakespeare and Milton and people like that. And they're talking about fairies, you know, obvious references to Midsummer Night's Dream and things like that. Milton wrote a poem in the mid-17th century called L'Allegro, in which it talks about Queen Mab, the queen of the fairies. And his description of what Queen Mab gets up to, it's like a job description for piskies, including playing tricks on people, rewarding people that work well, including stealing children or arranging for the theft of children, and all the sorts of things that piskies are supposed to do, Queen Mab does as well. This seems to be a completely different strand of folklore, though. The tale of Anne Jeffreys and the fairies and things like that appears mid-17th century. There isn't a giant within, I was going to say within 100 miles. There is a giant in 100 miles, but there isn't any folkloric interaction between piskies and giants. Spriggans, interestingly, who are more malevolent than piskies, seem to inhabit the tops of hills and cairns, the same sort of landscape as giants, and often they're guarding a treasure that is there somewhere. And they too, apart from the geographical coincidence, have no folkloric interaction between them. Various people have come up with suggestions that, for example, these are all sinful people, and because of their sins, they are gradually shrinking, and they become, or they might have started out being giants, but after years and centuries of generally being bad, they get down to being pisky sized, then they get down to the size of ants, and then they finally vanish altogether. But to summarize, I don't really see a folkloric link. I think that writers and folklorists coming along later have speculated they've made that up. I don't see any link in the source material that says that. Now, I completely get that, what we have to do is explore these things and see if we can find links. But just because something's in folklore doesn't mean that it's necessarily directly linked one to another. I just perceive that the giant tales are just that much older. They're if nothing else, they're recognised by Geoffrey of Monmouth. They were probably around centuries before then, and we don't see links to fair folk of any sort until we get to 17th century, perhaps 16th, and and in the tales that we have, they don't interact, and in the same way as in all but one occasion, you don't get saints' tales and tales of piskies and historic tales overlapping either. It's almost as if it's a completely different bucket of culture, and sort of drawing elements from water from different wells, I think is the way I'd put it, really.
We've had a look at a few different giant stories from around Cornwall, and as you can see, there does seem to be a real concentration in the area around West Cornwall in particular. And to me, that's definitely got to have something to do with the landscape, the number of rocky places and Neolithic sites. We've touched on some of the themes in there and talked about the possible origins of these ideas. I'm particularly fascinated by this idea of prominent places in the landscape, and historically the local relationships between landowners over control of these strategically important locations. How some of these stories, at least, may have evolved from that over the centuries. And certainly it seems that traditions and beliefs around giants in Cornwall could go further back in time than I initially thought. There's definitely something about these mythical beings that still appeals to us. Thinking of the number of fairy tales and children's stories, fantasy novels and the like, that still include giants and ogres and similar creatures. And it makes you wonder why, and why here in Cornwall in particular, are we still drawn to them?
Why do you think that they're still a subject, that giants in general, and their stories are still something that kind of continues to sort of fascinate us? Because I can remember being a child and sort of being terrified of the idea of giants, these big creatures that might go around eating small children and carrying off livestock, but equally being fascinated by them as well.
I think it's the same as dinosaurs. Kids like dinosaurs. I mean, my grandchildren could name every type of dinosaur that has ever lived, and knew far more about them than me. And they just tick a box about a big, horrible creature, but it's sufficiently far away. It's sufficiently far away. You can reach out, but you can't touch it. It can be your alter ego. You can be a hero and fight it, but you don't actually have to face it yourself. And I think the same is probably true of giants. Creatures, whether they be large, small, or just strange, continue to exist in our imagination because we always want to explain the inexplicable. And when we are graced with some great piece of good luck or some awful piece of bad luck, we feel that there has to be a reason for it. And we're always looking for a reason. And the explanation is just so easy when you can turn around and say, well, the cream went sour because you didn't leave something for the piskies, or the existence of that great big earthwork there, the giants did that. why did I have that rotten luck? Why did my garden wall fall down? Answer, it was a giant. He passed in the night, and he was careless and he stamped on it and my wall fell down. It's a lot easier to say that than to say, I wasn't a very good wall builder. Like that. So yeah, we always have questions, and it's easy to find an answer in the landscape, in superstition, in folklore. I mean, I've got friends who, when it's the new moon, as I think we're about new moon right now, actually, they will not look on the new moon through glass. They will take the silver from their pocket and they will turn it over 3 times in the light of the new moon. And that's to bring them good luck. And that's happening in Cornwall in 2024. And these are, perfectly sensible, rational people, but they still do that, There are lots of traditional things that keep going despite the way that civilization, if that's what it is, evolves. Traditions still lurk out there in the countryside. And I'm not talking about either historical sort of old Cornwall society type revival or neo-pagan revival, all of which have got their good points and perhaps some bad points as well. But but in the ordinary community, you find people that will go out there and still, unbeknownst to their neighbours, they will cry the neck. They will welcome in the new year in ways that are that suit them. They will wassail their apple trees, not in a big gathering that started at the local pub and has got 120 people and a TV crew in attendance, but they will do it because it's their apple trees and they want them to grow. And so they will go out there, they will find the apple tree man, they will look up at the hill, they will see the giant, they will look down into the well, they will see the piskies, because that's what enables them to see out the day, to see out the night, and to move on into the future. It's something that one's father and mother did, one's grandfather did, and the great-grandparents before then, And despite the world that we live in, it's still out there to this very day.
That's it for this episode. A big thank you to Mike O'Connor for taking the time to chat all things giant related. If you're interested in checking out Mike's work, he currently has a production called The Prophecy of Merlin, which is touring, and you can find out dates and more information at prophecyofmerlin.com. He also runs storytelling walks and has a fantastic book called Cornish Folktales that I highly recommend. If you've been enjoying this series so far, then please don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. If you have ideas for a future episode, or you have any thoughts on something relating to local folklore, then please feel free to get in touch. You can email me at thepiskietrap@gmail.com. We'll be back again very soon to explore a completely different topic. But for now, take care, and thanks for listening. The Piskie Trap is written and presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Karis Harrington.